Good morning. Last week in our Parasha, B'Shalach, we looked at that big climactic event when Israel was finally set free out of Egypt. Israel's prayers were answered and they were liberated. However, as we saw, answered prayer does not mean the end of difficulties. As Israel set out into the wilderness, there were just more trials that they had to face, whether it was the attack of Pharaoh, the lack of food, or the lack of water. And this showed us that trials in life are unavoidable. So the question should not be, how do I avoid difficulties, but rather, how do I grow through them? And we saw that answer last week. In the midst of our difficulties, in the midst of trials, do not doubt, is the Lord among us or not, as Israel did, but rather, what is God teaching me in the process? Since trials are always opportunities for God to show his power and to further shape us. Now this morning, we're going to continue our journey with Israel through the wilderness in our parasha, which is called Yitro. Can you say that with me? Yitro. Very good. Look at all this Hebrew we're learning. It's amazing. And this means Jethro. And this is the name of Moses' father-in-law. So if you're ever in Bible trivia, now you know this good answer. His name is Jethro. Now, this is only 3 chapters, this parasha, going from Exodus 18 all the way to the end of Exodus 20, but there are a lot of life-altering events that happen in these short chapters, one of them being the giving of the 10 Commandments, which we're going to look at. But one of the amazing themes that we see in these 3 chapters is how, as they're getting closer to Mount Sinai, God is preparing the nation to walk in obedience to him. He first prepares them as a community, and then he prepares them individually and spiritually, and then finally he gives his commands. And you see, God did not redeem Israel out of Egypt so that they could live a carefree life. He didn't say, hey, you're out, have fun in the wilderness. No, he brought them out of slavery so that they could enter into a covenant and a relationship with him. And in a similar way, Paul speaks about how the Lord rescued us from the kingdom, into the kingdom of his beloved Son. But in the same way, God didn't redeem us just so we could have a carefree life or just to be happy. But rather, just as he prepared Israel, he prepares us physically, he prepares us spiritually so that we could walk in his commands and live in a way that is honoring to him. So the question is, what does that obedience look like? And that's what we're going to see this morning in Parasha Yitro. So our parasha opens up, Exodus 18, Israel, they're on their way to Mount Sinai, and here Moses reunites with his father-in-law Jethro. Now we first met Jethro all the way back in Exodus 3. If you remember the story, Moses had to run from Egypt, and then he met Jethro in Midian. And does anyone know the profession of Jethro? What was Jethro? A priest. A priest of who? We don't know, but it probably wasn't the God of Israel, probably a foreign god. And yet, right in Exodus 18, you see the transformation of Jethro, where Moses comes to him and he tells him the stories of what God has done, both the good and the bad. And what does Jethro declare? Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods. And this shows you the importance of sharing what God is doing in your life. Never count it short, always share with one another because it encourages each other. And I love what Moses says. It says, Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh for Israel's sake and all the hardships that had befallen them on their journey. See, Moses didn't just present the good and, we're so great and God took us out. He showed the difficulties as well. He showed the trials and he showed the failures. He showed both sides of it. And it's that transparency that is so important because it points to God as a deliverer and it puts the emphasis on him. And so things are looking good for Israel. They're acting as a light to the nations, which is what they are called to do. We see that with Jethro, but this is where God starts to prepare the nation to live in obedience. So the first thing we see is how he prepares them as a community, socially. In Exodus 18, it opens up and it says that Moses, he was sitting in the seat of judgment, and from morning until evening, he would be judging cases all day. Anyone who had a dispute, they would come to him. Can you imagine how draining that would be? Constantly people coming to you, you have to make legal decisions, and then whatever decision you make, someone's going to be angry with you, right? It would be a very draining process. And so Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, he proposes a new structure. He says to Moses, choose men who fear God, choose men who know truth, choose people who hate dishonest gain, so they can't be bribed, and in essence, choose good judges. Take these judges and put them over 50 people. Then take other judges, put them over the hundreds. Then other judges over the thousands, and then Moses will be at the top. Essentially, he created a hierarchy so that legal decisions could be made. Now, you may have read this before and thought, okay, great, let's just keep reading. What is the point of this narrative? But you see, God prepared Israel as a community to be able to take the Torah that he was going to reveal and apply it to the people. So he prepared them culturally and socially. Now as we move on to Exodus 19, we see that God prepares them spiritually to receive his commands. As they arrive to Mount Sinai, they're there, and what does God tell Moses to do? The people have to consecrate themselves for 3 days. What does that mean? They have to set themselves apart. This implies that they would not just go about their daily lives or normal lives as if everything is normal, but rather pause, rest, focus, dwell, kind of like what we're called to do this morning. Take a pause from everything else and focus on the Lord. And this way, in Exodus 18, he prepared them culturally. Exodus 19, he prepared them spiritually. And then in Exodus 20, we have the giving of the 10 Commandments. Now, many people wonder why. Why highlight these 10 Commandments in Exodus 20? Does anyone know how many laws are there, or have we counted in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah? Does anyone know? Okay, 613. Very good. 613. So why focus on these 10? You guys will be very good at Bible trivia now. Jethro, 613. You guys know your answers. Why focus on these 10? Well, on the one hand, these 10 commandments are the ones that God gave to the entire nation. After these 10, he only started to speak through Moses. So that's one of the reasons why it's important. But the other is because the 10 commandments are really like a summary of the law. All the other laws kind of grow out of these 10. And when you actually read them, the first 4 of the 10 commandments are about loving God. And the next 6 are about loving your neighbor. And that's really the heartbeat of the law, of the Torah, and that's God's heartbeat. Love God and love your neighbor. And that's why when Yeshua was asked, what is the greatest command? What did he say? To love the Lord your God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. And that is our calling as well. These two things are 100% connected. If anything, the way that we treat our neighbor is kind of a reflection of our love for God. So we see what God did with Israel as a nation, right? He took them out of slavery, he prepared them as a community, he prepared them spiritually, and then he gave the command so they could walk in obedience. And in the same way, this is what he did to us. He took us out from the dominion of darkness. He put us into a community here at Beth Ariel. He prepares us spiritually with his Holy Spirit living in us. And then he calls us to walk in obedience to his word. And so the question is, are we walking in obedience by loving God and loving our neighbor? Once again, Yeshua, he closely links these two things. They go hand in hand. In 1 John, we're warned, if somebody says, I love God, yet hates his brother, he lies about his brother, or he gossips about them, or if he speaks down towards them, then that person is a liar. The one who loves God must also love his brother. And this is the calling and the fruit of the Spirit that we need to emanate in our community this morning and hereforth. So as we prepare our hearts to worship this morning, there's at least 2 things from Parasha Yitro that require some reflection. First, how is God preparing us today? What has he been teaching us throughout this week? What are the things that when we listen, that he convicts us? And if we say, I don't know, I don't really hear anything, that's fine, because we have a great model in Parasha Yitro. Just as Israel consecrated 3 days, set themselves apart to listen, to dwell, to focus, so we should also consecrate 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, to focus, to read, to pray, and to meditate. And this will allow us to hear better as the Spirit convicts. So first, how is God preparing us? And second, are we living out our calling to love God and to love people? Yeshua gave us the greatest example. What does it mean to love people? Does it mean to just tolerate them, listen to them until they're done speaking? What does that actually mean? Yeshua showed us. It's to serve them. Are we in our community serving one another? Are we being the hands and the feet of the Messiah as we care for each other, getting involved, and pushing one another onto godliness? So remember, as God gives us his commands, as he gives us his word, his revelation, he also prepares us to live it out. So our calling today is to always seek ways of honoring the Lord and go through and serve one another and care for each other as a representation of Yeshua.